Welcome here to Mill Hill Chapel. My name's Joe, I'm the minister here. Mill Hill Chapel was founded in 1672. There has been a congregation worshipping on site on this spot for 350 years, and it's still a living spiritual community. We still hold faith with the ideals of our founders who set up a dissident space, a free religious inquiry, a space of free religious inquiry, and that's still what we do to this day. We host a Buddhist Sangha here on Saturdays. Before lockdown, we were hosting a Sikh Simran on Tuesdays and a Muslim Jamaat on Fridays, so there were 4 different spiritual traditions worshipping under this roof at one time. But we also host a refugees, asylum seekers conversation club. We host recovery groups. Currently we have a group for women who suffered stillbirth. We have a choir for people who are recovering from neurological trauma. We have other choirs that are based here. All the work we do is made possible by you drinking at that bar. You won't often hear a minister of religion encouraging you to go to the bar, but such are the strange times in which we live. Our bar is pay as you feel, so I hope you feel generous. The reason I mention our bar, really, is that after our talk today, we're going to open up so that perhaps we can remain a little while after this talk by Dougald and Q&A, and so we can maybe investigate and explore further the themes that Dougald will be sharing with us, with Lydia's help. I'm going to let them do the introduction for this evening's event and tell you all about what's going to happen. And I think I'm also going to ask David to open up for us with a song. Is that right? Great. Okay. I'm going to hand over there. Thanks very much.
Good evening, everybody. This is the usual warning before playing a song. I might put the words and go. So there we go. This is a song that is on the playlist that Lydia has made for Dougald's book. Do you feel them, angels of the future, poised for war, hanging over the paralyzed present? And everyone is stood on their toes, setting their anxious jaws, straining to see the unmoving wall of time horizon. And the axes of our struggles are too many intersecting, and the tribes are all alive like rushing rivers, and they're dancing to the beat drums around towers and wells and millions of liturgies, retelling the world her story once again. And all the world was silent and still for half an hour, and all the world was clamoring like it never did before, and there were cracks down the sides of the towers here creaking. We carried on, listless living, staring through our secrets, unspeaking. And yes, you will try crying and then laughing into space, to exercise the unflexed shudder in your bodies, staring at the arc of the horizon, to rest your tired eyes as your ears come alive to the song of all dead witness Jesus Christ. And the world was asleep, and the world was alive, and the world was all still, and it was dancing like fireflies, and the world didn't want itself crashing waves on the shore. Listening to your secrets, breathing quiet labor pain. Towers and walls, trees and walls, story shall be burned from her two wrists, and all the kings will quake before her unrelenting fearless gaze. And the kings gave solemn words from their thrones for the bricks to be baked in rage in ovens by the labour of those who would never climb the mighty towers that they built, but they would walk on stilts toward the many promises of employed oils and oranges. And the kings gave solemn words from their thrones for the bricks to build a wall to encircle the faithful as a refuge from the fall, however, outside the towers. Neither would they wander in the wastes outside the walls. They praise Jesus, their managed lives. And the names of the kings were the only that were spoken, and their names were the names above all names on the mouths of their servants, their opponents, and their impartial commentators. For there were no other worlds besides the towers, walls, and furnaces. And the world was asleep, and the world was alive, and the world was all still, and it was dancing like my fireflies, and the world did walk itself to lap the threshold of the waves, and told her many secrets, breathing quiet labor and pain. Towers and walls, trees and walls, and home over horizons many. Towers and walls, beasts and soil, and home in our bones they're buried. Go wander, dear ones, scatter ourselves like stones. These towers and these walls shall no longer be your homes, which your ancestors built by the forced hands of those they colonized. A machine flexing rubber bands beheld with never flinching eyes. Go wander, dear ones, let dialects diverge. Go and find margin in forgotten places of the earth and listen to her poetry, her unmanaged words, and pray in deep rivers of infinity and circles of rebirth. Go wander, dear ones, this shall not be our home. Obliged to live our futures of the past, it's not your own. Ever baking bricks for the colonizers' towers, ever within the walls of the colonizers' power. Go wander, dear ones, take off your dirty boots, abandon now the building of their towers and grow roots. Find a little space, stay a while and trust me, and let your roots grow slow together and reimagine. And the world was asleep, and the world was alive, and the world was all still, and it was dancing like my fireflies, and the world moved itself to the lacquer threshold of the waves, and told her many secrets, and breathed the quiet labor and pain. Towers and walls, trees and walls,
much, David. Yeah, David said just there that was a song from the playlist that I made to go alongside the book, but he didn't say that it's his song. We should probably say that that's your song. It's called Home, and it's on Spotify if everyone wants to listen. Oh, can we not hear me? Joe, can you give me a bit of a boost, please? Joe, can you give me a lot of a boost, please? Otherwise I speak like this and I'm on the radio. All right, then I'll do that. Can you hear me a bit better? Nice one. Shout if it becomes an issue, though. Thank you all for being in this room, and thank you. We've got people watching online, and I'm aware that there are probably about double the number of people watching online as there are in the room. So amazing to have so many faces and voices with us this evening. Thank you to Dougald for asking me to celebrate your new book, which has been such a long time coming. Dougald and I were introduced in 2016 at a point where my work was definitely leading me towards the ruins, and we were introduced by a mutual friend who said, I think you two will probably have a few things to talk about. And this many years later, I think we still do.
It's true.
But I've known for quite a long time, I've known you as someone who writes in all sorts of places, but you've never written your own book. So how does it feel to have your own book?
Yeah, people ask me how long did it take me to write the book, and I say, well, 30 years and 7 weeks. So it's about 30 years from when I first started insisting that I was writing a book at the age of 15 to this, but it's about a year ago today that I actually sat down and began to write the first draft in earnest, and I had 7 weeks. And it came through in that time, because really the book is a distillation of lots of things that I've lived over a lot of those years, but seen from a place that I hadn't got to until very close to when I began writing it. And I think that whether or not we write books, I think that can be true for many of us in our lives, that we come to a point where it's possible to look back and trace patterns that we didn't see at the time and find meaning within events that weren't obviously coherent or meaningful at the time. And that's not some fake thing that you impose. That's actually the nature of the perspective of, you know, you can never experience the consequences of a thing in the present tense, because the consequences happen later, and part of the meaning of the thing is always bound up with its consequences. So yeah, it feels wonderful. And then, because of having left it so long and having done so many other things and got to work with and learn from so many other wonderful people, now that I'm finally have this thing to bring out in the world, and my friends are all shocked, but we get to celebrate it together and bring so many of the things that fed into it and share them with more people by doing things like we're doing tonight. So yeah,
Reading it, it certainly did come across as that sort of distillation and revisiting of stories over lots and lots of years. But the stories involved in the book aren't just yours. You are someone more than most people I know who refer to other people, other theorists, writers, speakers as part of your work. A third of the words in the book aren't yours. They're words that you value from other people. Can you talk a bit about how story and interweaving stories are part of this work that we're doing in the ruins?
Yeah, I mean, one of the people whose story I tell at a point in the book is a man called Gustavo Esteva, who died last year at the age of 85. He's a Mexican activist, and he would call himself a deprofessionalized intellectual, which I think sounds better in Spanish potentially than it does in English, but a thinker and a doer. And I remember him quoting to me somebody whose name I'm going to forget now, but who was both Hindu and a Catholic priest and stood in both those identities. So sort of sits well with the way that Joe introduced this as a space, who used to say, we are not within nets of relations. To be a human is not to be this isolated thing that then later comes into comes into friendships and relationships and doing things together. It's the opposite way around. It's we come out of relations, biologically it's true, but we're formed by all of the friendships and encounters and collisions and collaborations of our lives. And so to me, I don't really know another way to write a book than to have it be a moment within a weave of conversations that hopefully can be generous in the way that it allows the fruits of those conversations to travel further than they can do when they're happening like this. And then it works if it has started more conversations. That's sort of, that's what these tools are for, I think.
You've been part of so many different conversations over the years. I imagine that some of those have changed your worldview, surprised you, taken you off track a little bit. Do you know that's happening when it's happening?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so somebody who I used to have conversations with when I was in my sort of late 20s, and I tell the story early in the book that I had this experience of being good at passing exams and getting to a good university and coming out of that and sort of looking in the career service handbook, and I thought, well, I'm good at talking and I like words. Radio journalist, that sounds like something I could do. And I lasted about a year at the BBC before it dawned on me that I wasn't very happy and that I couldn't really see myself. Actually, I'm making this sound more coherent than it was. At the time, the way it happened was that I was offered a staff job after a year or so of working on short-term contracts. And I turned it down because my best mate from Darlington, where I did most of my growing up, called me the same day after midnight. And I happened to have worked very late at the radio station that night. And as I was coming out, I get this phone call and I answer it. And he says, you know how you always said if the other room in our flat came free? He was living down in London, by the way, and I was working in Sheffield for the BBC. You always said if the other room in our flat came free that we should give you a call. Well, my housemate's done a bunk and she hasn't paid the rent. And our landlord's given us a fortnight to find someone else or I'm getting kicked out. Do you want to move to London? And my heart said yes. And so to the station manager's surprise, I turned down the staff job that he'd offered me. And I blithely thought, aged 25, having got good marks in everything so far in my life, that I would just breeze down to London and waltz into a freelancing career. And I waltzed into a career where 2 months later I was temping in warehouses and call centres. And feeling this sense of freedom, because when I'd been working at the BBC, I used to come home and my brain was tired after an 8-hour shift. I was working in warehouses. My body was tired, but I could sit and read all evening, and I had to read in order to help myself answer the question of what was I going to do with whatever was ahead of me. I've forgotten why I'm even telling this story, Lydia.
That's
Can you
all right.
Can you remember?
That's the point.
That's the point.
That's what conversation does, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what did happen next?
What did happen next was among the reading I did that spring, there were a couple of books that just landed almost magically, that felt like a letter that could have been addressed to me from the sort of wiser, older friend that I badly needed at that moment in my life. One of them was Alistair McIntosh's book, Soil and Soul. And I had the great pleasure of doing the first event for this book on Saturday night in Galgale in Glasgow with Alistair and 2 other friends on stage together. And when I got to the end of reading Soil and Soul, which is about the land reform movement in Scotland that he'd been at the heart of and the campaign to stop the super quarry on the Isle of Harris, I remember feeling, here's somebody who's an activist, who's not just fueled by anger, who's already middle-aged, who seems to have actually achieved some things with the activism he's been part of. And I think it's really important when you're at that stage in your life to find people a generation or 2 older than you, where you can look at them and go, I could set a course by the way that your life has been. I'm not going to end up where you are or go there, but you've given me proof that there are ways of being a grown-up that speak to me in a way that not all of the grown-ups who I've had around me so far in my life have spoken to me. So that was a very important book. And the other one was John Berger's book, The Shape of a Pocket, which, yeah, I could talk about John Berger all night.
I know, so I'm going to cut you off. I'm laughing because before this started, we were having a conversation about the fuck moment, the moment where you go, oh my God, the world's burning. What do I do with this? And I had the beginnings of that moment in 2016, around the time that we were introduced. And as we've said, this is your first book, but it's not the first time your writing's been public. And there were a lot of your words in my world at that time. So hearing you talk about Alistair McIntosh and the way that his book set a course, and that you could say, okay, someone's been there, someone's been scared before, and they've written about it. I resonate, and I can hear language from writing that I read from you in 2016 to 2018 that still stays with me, not least this idea of deep time and placing ourselves in a much, much longer time scale than the immediate. It's not explicitly referenced in the book, but it feels like there's a slowness to what you're suggesting as being good work in the ruins. Can you say more about that?
Well, when you say that, I think of my friend Bayo Akomolafe, a Nigerian philosopher and poet and psychologist, he always says, the situation is urgent. We need to slow down. And there's definitely, one of the threads that's here in the book is about time and how we place ourselves, how we locate ourselves within time. And, as somebody who then, a few years on from those encounters with Alistair's work and Berger and so on, found myself firstly writing the Dark Mountain Manifesto together with Paul Kingsnorth, which really kind of propelled me out into a more public role. And because of the things we'd said there, I got invited into a lot of conversations about climate change. Found myself on a lot of stages in front of rooms full of people talking about climate change. And for a while, when I was working on the first draft, this book was going to be called Why I Am No Longer Talking to People About Climate Change. There are lots of reasons why it's not actually called that. But one of the things that began to unsettle me over the years in the conversations about climate change that I was part of was the way in which time is often operating in our conversations about climate change. And those of you who work with this will be very familiar with the kind of frantic quality of it. And I mean, there's a lot in the book where I'm reflecting on the 2018, well, the climate movements that sort of erupted in 2018, actually weirdly in the two countries that I call home, in Sweden and in the UK. Greta Thunberg beginning her school strike in Sweden, and XR spilling onto the streets of London and so on. And I've had the luck to spend time with a lot of the key people in those movements. And as I say in the book, they have a courage that I don't pretend to share, putting their bodies on the line in order to interrupt business as usual, in order to say, like, when are we going to talk about what's really going on? So the book is written kind of as a love letter to them and as a love letter to the climate scientists that I've worked with as well. But, sometimes when you love people, you have to say what you really think rather than what you think they'd like to hear. And there are elements of that within the book, which have, I'm glad to say, been received so warmly and become the starting point for some really fruitful conversations with my friends in those worlds. And that thing about time, how many times have I heard myself say or heard friends say, we've got however many years it is we say now, 7 years? I don't know. We've got X number of years left. And gradually I came to mistrust that language, because in a sense, and other people have definitely said this, it's already too late in one sense. But then you have to ask, too late for what? It's too late to make the ways of living that most of us grew up taking for granted sustainable. That's not going to happen. But when we talk in that language that sort of says like, if it really lands on people, and you see this when you talk to young people who've been in the climate movements today, the weight that we're putting on people's shoulders when we say it's all about what we do in the next 7 years is an unbearable weight that will break people. And we could talk more about brokenness as we go on in this conversation. But, so on the one hand, that troubled me about it. And on the other hand, it also troubled me because I began to realize that it sort of smuggles back in a dark hubris, a certain pride. If it's all about us now, if the whole fate of the world and everything that's been building up to now in human history and planetary history is all sitting on our shoulders in the next 7 years, I am suspicious of that. Because modernity, this period in time that we are in some sense living at the end of, has always been addicted to telling a story in which it's all about us now. And to bring that back in a kind of darker way, in the ways that we talk about climate change, there's something there that, as Alistair McIntosh would say, the flame doesn't quite burn clean there. So I was then stuck for a while with how to voice this sense that another temporality, another way of being within time might be called for. And then my friend Sarah Thomas, who's a wonderful writer who was also at the thing in Glasgow on Saturday, she told me a story that she had heard from Tyson Yunkaporta, Australian Aboriginal thinker and maker and writer. I don't know, you'd have to ask him where he heard it from. Maybe he heard it from the land. But the way that it came to me was, if we are lucky, we're somewhere in the early going of an unfolding that is going to take 1,000 years. Because that's how long it's going to be before there is a world of old growth forests again, because that's how long it takes for the mother trees to grow. And the place where Tyson comes from is more on the front line of climate change than the places where most of us come from. So I don't think he's saying that naively. I think he's as aware as any of us of the extent to which it takes faith to imagine a world ahead of us in which trees grow old. But I find within that telling, that's literally the story that I end the last page of the book on, because within it there is an invitation to me to humble myself, to get out of the center of the story, to admit that, the story I am part of is going to be going on after I'm gone. And none of us in this room are going to know, to the extent that it makes sense to speak of a story with an ending, none of us are going to be around for the end of the story. But nonetheless, that there might be work to be done. There might be things we could be doing that contribute to the possibility of there being a world of old growth forests. And that's just one example of what a living culture and a living world in the times to come might look like. There is work we can do now that places us within that process without telling a story that makes that process all about us now and the decisions we make in the next 7 years. It doesn't mean that there aren't things we need to do, or more importantly, stop doing urgently in the times we're in. But I think it's healthier if we can find a way of grounding ourselves in a longer story and making ourselves a small link within a chain rather than the people that the whole story is about.
Which reminds me of one of the stories that you reference in the book from Federico Campagna. Is that the name? Of making good ruins, this idea of making good ruins within our lifetime. What does that look like or feel like for you?
Well, this was a blessing that came to me as I was almost finished on the book. I got an email from my friend Liz Slade, who, if those of you who are connected to the Unitarians will know, she's the chief officer of the Unitarians. And she was forwarding me a message from the Unitarian minister in Cambridge, who's a very philosophical and widely read man. And in this message was this reference to this guy called Federico Campagna. And the name struck a chord because I'd met him once at an event that I helped to organise in honour of John Berger in London 10 years ago. And someone had told me at the time that he was really into Dark Mountain, and I hadn't really tuned into his work at the time. But I found this video where he was talking about his most recent book, which is called Prophetic Culture. It feels appropriate in the light of David's song that opened the evening, which is full of prophetic language. But I found that Federico was speaking in different language in terms of his reference points, the people he'd read, the kind of people he was writing for, but that we had some really powerful resonances between his work and what I'd been trying to say in the book. And And the bit that really struck a chord with me was he said, sometimes you are born into the ending of a world. Sometimes you're born into the ending of a world. This is a thing that happens. It has happened before. Worlds have ended. Worlds do end. He said, how do you notice if it is your fate to have been born into the ending of a world? Well, one symptom of it is that the future doesn't work anymore. Because the future in the ordinary sense, the future in the way that politicians might try to talk about the future in a speech to mobilize people and bring people together around collective projects, that future is an extension of the story we're already in. It's a projection forward from the recent past through the present to something to come that has some kind of continuity, that belongs within the same story, that has the same logic. When a world is coming to an end, the arc of its story is reaching its end. So when people try and project it outwards, that doesn't sound convincing anymore. And I think that a lot of what we've witnessed, the sort of morbid symptoms in Gramsci's terms of politics in the last 10 years in various countries, including Sweden, has a quality of belonging to a time when the future no longer works. I quote Anthony Barnett, the founder of Open Democracy, who was a great friend of John Burge's, in the book. Anthony wrote a fabulous book about Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, which was the most thoughtful and sympathetic book written by somebody who had voted Remain, seriously looking at what was going on there rather than getting stuck in the kind of defensive cliches that are often part of how people have talked about those events. And one thing he says is, those two slogans, take back control and make America great again. The most important words in those slogans are back and again. It's the power of the appeal to the past. And we've also seen people on the left who have attempted to reboot the future in the last 10 years. In a sense, some of the people around the Corbyn project were trying in good faith to do that. Somebody like Paul Mason, in his books, has tried to do that, but I don't think it works, because that's not the nature of the moment. That's not the key that the music is in now. It's not the nature of the moment we're in. But what do you do? So Federico Campagna says, if it is your discernment that you have been born into the ending of the world into which you were born, then maybe what you do is you stop worrying so much about trying to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending, and start looking for ways to make good ruins. Start having one eye on what will be left behind, because lots of things are going to be left behind by the world that is ending. And of course, some of them are toxic legacies that will be there for 10,000 years or more. But there are also other things that will be picked up, turned around, used in ways we can't imagine now, but will be legacies of the world whose ending I'm suggesting we were born into. And this I found helpful, not least because I have been drawn again and again to work with people who get to call themselves artists. Sitting here tonight. And one of the things that I've said in my dialogues with them over the years, at one point I got asked to come and work at the Swedish National Theatre, despite never having worked in theatre.
I've read the script. You did a great job.
Well, it was an experience, and my job there was to be leader of artistic development, so I had to try and work out if I knew what those words meant. And one of the things that kind of came to me in that work was that art and the arts and this, the cultural sector, or whatever we call it, within modernity has had a special role. It's been this enclave in modern societies where the things you do are not fully expected to make sense in the ways that everybody else in just about every other field has to justify their work to spreadsheets and productivity and efficiency. And this is part of why artists are sometimes so hated. It's part of why it's so easy for tabloids to, whip up anger at, some ridiculous art project that's received funding, is because it's a double-edged thing. If you have this artistic license that you get to access that funding, of course, the reality for nearly everybody who has that is that you tend to live in a condition of precarity. but it's a privileged form of precarity. And you have to be aware, I think, of that double-edgedness, that if you are unaware, if you're not conscious of the extent to which you have a strange kind of freedom that hardly anyone else in society gets to have, at least in the parts of their life where they might get paid some money, if you're unaware of that, you can be very offensive by accident, let's say. But in Federico Campagna's terms, this thing of, the logic of stop trying to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending and start trying to leave good ruins. Well, artistic organizations and projects, especially the smaller ones that are held together as much by love and mutuality and relationships as they are by the bits of funding that they sometimes manage to get hold of, have a special position. They can be portals between the world that is ending and presently unimaginable worlds that might come after, precisely because they don't have to make sense. They don't have to justify themselves as rigorously to the logics of economic rationality as nearly every other kind of organization does. So just that bit of Federico's work helped me make sense of why I kept getting drawn back to working with artists.
Yeah, me too. That bit really resonated. One of my favorite things is that my job title changes with every project that I'm involved in, but I always say, just make me the scapegoat. Just say, oh, Lydia made me do it. She's ridiculous. She's the artist. It gets there faster. Art gets there faster. You've said already that worlds have ended before, and some of them are talked about in the book. And I wonder if you have a sense that we are more resistant to the end of our world than others have been, and whether there's learning from worlds having ended before that we could be leaning on just now.
Yes, I think that, something, I write quite a bit about death in the book. I write quite a bit about the strange relationship with endings, including, or starting with death, because in a sense, death is kind of the archetypal ending for creatures like us. Like every other ending is kind of understood through the lens of that, I think, at some level. And I talk about the work of a Canadian man, Stephen Jenkinson, who worked for decades with the dying and their families. And he wrote a wonderful book called Die Wise. And one of the things that he's talking about in there is the sense that, as seen from elsewhere, from other cultural starting points, Western modernity looks really weird. And one of the things that makes it look weird is that, in Jenkinson's terms, our societies are death-phobic societies. I talk quite a bit about initiation in the book, and about the way that in different times and places, human cultures have, despite having far fewer resources in the terms we talk about it than the society that we were born into, nonetheless put a good part of their resources into the work of initiation, into the things that a community comes together to do around thresholds, around important moments, especially in the lives of young people as they're growing up. And if you look cross-culturally at what anthropologists and indigenous writers and so on have to tell us about initiation, one of the common features is some kind of staged but very real feeling, experience of an encounter with your own mortality that you're led up to the edge of when you are somewhere in your teens. And when I write about that, I think about my own adolescence and the sort of foolish, risk-fueled activities that you go through at points along the way that were sort of our improvised attempts to create something that might take us to the edge of ourselves. But I guess one of the, and I think that part of why that has been important in so many cultures is that in order for us to become grown-ups, we need to have a real encounter with our own mortality. And also, it means that we don't meet it for the first time when it comes for real. But part of why I find myself writing about initiation in the book is because I realized in the 2018-2019 moment of the kind of climate activism before the pandemic, I was going around and talking to a lot of local XR groups and talking with people who had found themselves in the spotlight within these movements. And I recognized that people were having experiences that really had a kind of initiatory quality to them. This was not, this was really not like the previous moment of climate awareness and activism when leading voices were people like Al Gore doing a kind of after-dinner speech in front of a glorified PowerPoint presentation that's sort of walking people up to a viewing platform a quarter of a mile from the edge of the abyss and explaining it in theoretical terms and then walking you back down and giving you a list of 8 things we can do that can make all of the scary stuff go away. You listen to Greta Thunberg or Roger Hallam or Gail Bradbrook or Jem Bendell, and I have different things to say about some of them in the book, but what was very true and very powerful about them was that they were evidently hanging out over the abyss themselves. You could see their sleepless nights on their faces and hear it in their voices. And that gave so many people permission to speak about what they secretly felt when they couldn't sleep in the middle of the night and not keep that to themselves. And that was in a much smaller way what Paul Kingsnorth and I had done when we started Dark Mountain, was we created a space to which it was safe to come and admit your fears and darknesses, your despair, if that was what you were carrying at that point, without seeing despair as something to be avoided at all costs, and without seeing it as necessarily the end of the story. It can just be a phase that you need to pass through in order to be changed. But what was different in 2018 was that there were actual forms of activism that were coming from a place beyond hope, and that were really drawing a kind of deep power, and I would say a spiritual power from that, and that were taking people to an encounter with climate change, not as something that can be fixed or made manageable, reconciled with existing trajectories of progress or development, but as something that's calling us into question. Calling our stories of who we are, what history is like, where it's all headed, what kind of world we're living in, what part people like us have been playing within that world, calling all those stories and desires and entitlements that go with them into question. And there's a passage that I quote from a pair of anthropologists, Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena, from a book called A World of Many Worlds. And they're talking about, some of the conversations that have been starting in cities like Berlin or London or Stockholm or New York about climate change and about this thing that gets called the Anthropocene, the geological epoch that is brought about as a result of the consequences of human activity. And there's lots of different arguments about what it should be called, what would be a better name for it than the Anthropocene. But what they say in that book is that whole conversation, for people listening from elsewhere, and a lot of the people that they're working with are in Latin America, so people listening from elsewhere, it sounds a lot like the world of the powerful becoming conscious for the first time that its world too could end, after 5 centuries of going around the world, ending other people's worlds and calling that progress, development, salvation, economic growth. And they say, and I sort of build on this in the book, there's 2 very different ways that it can go from there. On the one hand, that can be a sort of humbling encounter, where finally, because our vulnerability is brought home to us, and often for privileged people in Western countries, climate change is the place that brings people to that edge, to that encounter with the fragility, the sense that the ship could be going down. The story of progress might be breaking and might not have been as true as we thought it was all along. It can be a humbling encounter where it becomes possible for us to listen to and learn from and enter into dialogue and solidarity with people who have been trying to tell us for generations about the shadow side of that story of progress that we were enjoying the shiny side of. And a lot of the voices that I listen to in the book, a lot of the friends I'm in dialogue with are coming from other parts of the world, from being on the receiving end of processes of modernization. But the other thing that can happen is that this sense of vulnerability can be turned around into the source of legitimacy for one more push, one more turn of the wheel of a big global project of trying to map the whole of the world on a spreadsheet and manage it from Oxford or Cambridge or Leeds even. But, you know, try and see the world from above and master it and manage it in the name of saving the planet. And if I was half serious about saying why I'm no longer talking to people about climate change, it's because I realized that taking climate change seriously now points in diametrically opposite directions, depending on which of those ways you answer it. And I heard this again in the lyrics of David's song, you know, the managed lives early on, and then the unmanaged later in the song. You know, there is a path, which I call the big path in the book, which is increasingly the direction that the loudest voices speaking about climate change are pointing towards, which is an attempt to further extend the project of making the world into something that is managed, known and managed by AI-assisted humans. And there's another path, which isn't even a single path, it branches away, which I call the small path, which is when we give up on the idea of the idea that the world can be known and managed in that way, or that it even needs to be.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
May I?
Yeah, please.
When you were talking about processes of initiation on our way to becoming grown-ups, it reminded me of a specific part of the book that had me grinning for a little bit, because you're quite scathing of grown-ups, or a lot of the people who consider themselves grown-ups that are given these big budgets and big roles, and who are telling us how we should feel about things and how we should direct our attention and our action. And then earlier on talking about moving at the pace of growing forests, and how just kind of at the opposite ends of any kind of spectrum those two things feel. So I'm wondering if yeah, I mean, you kind of came back round to it at the end there, but how do we stay brave and humble as we're growing up without being too grown up? There's so many tensions there.
Yeah, I mean, I use Yanis Varoufakis's phrase that he got from Christine Lagarde of the adults in the room. This is a chapter where I talk about this strange thing that happened around the same time as the beginning of the pandemic, actually, just coincidentally, which was a kind of turn in who was in charge of the story about climate change, where for a while, in sort of 2018, 2019, Greta Thunberg was the most powerful voice in the world, really, speaking about climate change. And I noticed this weirdness. So Joe Biden is elected, and the Financial Times runs this editorial that says, the grown-ups are back in charge in Washington. And there's this strange doubleness that happens, where on the one hand, yes, we'd had 4 years when, you know, the most powerful, quote unquote, man in the world was a man in his 70s who frequently behaved like a badly behaved toddler. But equally, in the same moment of the Trump presidency, you also had the strongest voice of moral authority in the world, in a sense, being a 16-year-old who wasn't yet allowed to vote. And both of those things, with this kind of turn that happened around Biden's election, you suddenly get, you know, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, writing this book about how we're going to fix the climate problem. Which is full of his stories about him and his billionaire friends and his phone calls to world leaders and so on. And it's really like the adults are back in charge. And, you know, just as Greta doesn't trust this, I don't trust this either. So I think we have really upside down models of what it means to be a grown-up. Like, I think the adults in the room, in the sense of the people. And I kind of unpack some stuff from Varoufakis's book about his experiences as Greek finance minister that gives some clues to, you know, the kind of the helplessness and ignorance and despair that is actually there in those rooms, where in the corridors that are meant to be the corridors of power. And I had a few experiences myself like that were part of how I ended up having to write the book. Because I started to get invited to very strange meetings in Brussels with people inside the European Commission who had got to a place of being really freaked out about climate change. And they were sort of organizing their own unofficial internal conferences because the official ones, they thought, were not talking about what was really going on. And what I encountered in them was a kind of black despair that was very different to anything that I'd ever encountered in, Paul or me or any of the people who'd been drawn to writing for Dark Mountain or taking part in the conversations and gatherings that we did with Dark Mountain. And it took me, I had to write the book in order to fully understand what the difference was. And as I got to the end of writing the book, the penny dropped, and I was like, those people in those rooms in Brussels who I was meeting had lost faith in the promises around which their institutions were structured. They no longer believed that their institutions could save the planet, fix climate change, build a sustainable future. But they hadn't questioned the theology within which that faith had been positioned. They hadn't questioned the idea that the world was the kind of thing that needs saving, and that if it was going to be saved, it was going to be saved by people like them in rooms like the rooms in which they spend their time. And that was where their despair was coming from. And so I really, really hope that for some of those people who I'm still in dialogue with, that this book might help be a bridge out of the sort of loop of cycling between, black despair or a kind of desperate optimism in which you're starting to bet on more and more dangerous measures in the name of trying to fix climate change, which is really coming fast down the path now. But equally, I draw a lot in the book on the work of Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who is a Brazilian education theorist, really, but an extraordinary thinker and activist, part of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective. And she wrote a book called Hospicing Modernity. And I love that phrase because it speaks to a kindness towards what is ending. And it's not trying to save modernity. It's also not trying to tear it down or stage some kind of revolutionary moment or rush into building what is coming next. Part of what that says for me is, and she develops this in her book, there are multiple roles that are called for if what we are actually needing to do is not try and make modernity sustainable, but give it a good ending. And those roles depend on where you find yourself, what skills you have, what position you're in. There are roles on the inside of institutions as well as roles on the outside. There are strange alliances that need to be built between the inside and the outside in such a moment that will have a different shape to them, to the kinds of relationships around which we built our institutions when it looked like everything was working. I see that being improvised from below after 13 years of austerity and Brexit and pandemic in this country, as I'm traveling around talking to people, visiting projects that, and my aunt was a senior probation officer in County Durham. And when a few years ago, some of you will know this, the probation service was privatized in a really horrific way. And there was a lot of fuss about it. And nearly all of the probation services in the UK went to the multinational outsourcing corporations. But in County Durham, a group that my aunt was part of managed to organise a cooperative bid that won the bid to run the probation service. But in the way that can happen if you put yourself in that kind of strange insider-outsider position that she had to do to be the sort of one of the forces behind that. By the time the bid was successful, she needed to leave the situation and let somebody else step in who didn't have the history of the struggles that it had taken to lead the next step. So she took early retirement. Now she is, I saw her last week. She came to a workshop that we did around the book in London, and she said, yeah, they've made me a badge that says Chaos Coordinator. She's working with her local church and community groups, setting up food banks and warm spaces and dealing with all sorts of needs that are there. And she said she'd been reading the book on the way down to the workshop, and she'd realized that it had brought her to a place, because they'd had several cases just in the past week of, services that are not able to do the jobs that legally they're meant to be doing, basically dumping people on their doorstep as a community network, people who are in moments of crisis, and them just having to pick up the pieces. And she said, I was feeling this anger, and it's a justified anger at the failure of the system. So, but as I was reading the book, I realized that it's not, that system is not coming back. We might get some reprieves along the way, but the long-term trajectory is not towards us managing to rebuild what was possible for a while in certain countries in the mid-20th century in terms of these social democratic achievements. And that actually, what she's part of, these kind of grassroots community networks, are going to be all that makes the difference. And what makes it possible for us to, do the work among the ruins. And I see that in more and more places. And I'm hoping that, through the conversations we're starting with the book, we can also help to give people some vocabulary and join up some of these networks to see this, including building those relationships with the people inside the systems who are aware that they are partially having to hospice the systems that they are working inside of.
And Hospicing Modernity is another book that I've read that it's a difficult book, but it's one that everyone in this room should definitely own, and one that I think you would say has paved the way for you to be able to write this one. They operate in a similar space.
I haven't actually said this, but it just occurred to me as we were sitting here. I was surprised and honoured to be asked by Vanessa to voice her audiobook. And I said to her, I don't think there's a publisher in the world right now that would think of asking a white English man to voice the audiobook of a book by a woman of colour from the global south. But it was our relationship and the work that we'd done together. And she said, I want the book to travel beyond the places that I get seen as coming from. And I was literally September 2021, when I had the series of conversations that I say early on in the book, or what kind of triggered this kind of slippage in me that led me to see the work I'd been doing differently and forced me to write the book, was the weeks in which I was recording. So I was stood there in a cupboard under the stairs in the barn at the bottom of our garden in Sweden, afternoon after afternoon, bringing Vanessa's words and her life experience through my body onto, not onto tape, but onto a digital recording, so that it could travel out into the world. And I'm sure, although I haven't sort of seen or said that until we're talking about it now, I'm sure that's part of what forced me to write this book. It's not just that without Vanessa having written her book, I couldn't have written this book, because that is true, but actually the experience of bringing her book through my body and how powerfully it affected me was part of what pushed me into writing this.
That's wild to hear, because having read lots of things that you've written, the tone of this book's really different, and we've said before, you don't think it's something you could have written 10 years ago. It's certainly not something I would have expected to read from you even when we met. And I remember making some notes at some point around, gosh, I wonder what Dougald's posture was writing this book, because once it's been through an editing process, it reads beautifully, as it should, but there must have been highs, lows, peaks, troughs. I don't hear any battle cry, even though you're clearly angry. I don't hear any kind of pulling the rug from under anyone else or tripping anyone else up in order to make your point, even though you clearly don't agree with everyone that you're talking about. There's a warmth to it. There's a challenge and a stretch to it. It feels a bit blueprintish in the way that Hospicing Modernity does, of here's one person doing the process, maybe you can too.
Yeah.
What was it like to write?
Thank you. Yeah, I think in some way I did have to kind of get broken open in order to write it. I had to come to, not a deep falling apart kind of crisis, but a being stripped raw kind of moment of questioning some of the things that I had heard myself saying over the years. And so there were various people who helped me find my bearings, firstly as writers, and then some of them I actually got to know when I'd had that moment in my 20s. And one of them is Alan Garner, novelist from Cheshire, who I grew up reading. I grew up knowing that my mum had known him for a while in the 70s, because she'd been a nurse on a children's ward in Manchester, where one of his children had been on the ward for 6 weeks. And Alan and his wife had kind of slightly adopted my mum. And over the next few years, when she was going through a rough time in her life in her late 20s, they'd invited her to come and stay at various points at their house. And by the time I was around, they were down to sort of Christmas card contact. I always grew up with this kind of knowledge that that there was a connection there. And then the autumn I turned 30, I went to hear him speak at the Temenos Academy in London. And I asked a question which he liked. And then I went up to his wife afterwards and I said, I bring greetings from my mum, Anne Hine, who was Anne Whitehead. And she started jumping up and down. And she said to her younger daughter who was there, she said, "This man's mother saved Catherine's life," which my mum insists is an exaggeration. Anyway, they then kind of slightly adopted me and invited me. On my 30th birthday, I got an email from Alan Garner saying, come and visit. And one of the stories that I heard from Alan around the kitchen table at Blackton, where they live, was he told me about meeting this Uzbek storyteller from Uzbekistan. An old man had this felt hat. He said he gave me his hat. And that was clearly a major cross-cultural gesture of recognition from one practitioner to another. And he said, and he told me, when he was 8 years old, he was picked by the old storyteller alongside 2 other boys. And they came and lived with the storyteller, and they were part of his household and part of all of the work of the household, and they were trained with him. And when they were 18, the other 2 were sent away. And when he was about 40, he was allowed to tell a story in public for the first time. And I thought, firstly, that's how seriously the work of telling stories has been taken in living cultures throughout human history, because it is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of the difference between us making it through hard times and not doing. But secondly, it has come to me lately how lucky I am that I utterly failed at writing the books I tried to write in my teens and 20s and 30s, because I have somehow managed not to not go out and make a fool of myself in public along the way. I've done plenty of that. But nonetheless, I feel very lucky to have accidentally managed to wait until I had served some kind of improvised apprenticeship and arrived at a voice that I wasn't capable of when I was younger in the things that I'm getting to write now.
I have just a couple of other questions, but I'm really conscious that there are probably some in the room. So if you're beginning to form one, or kind of it's on the tip of your tongue, I'll come to you in a second. But I wanted to ask, I have a hunch that you were talking about climate change and you got involved in the world of climate change because it felt like a portal to talking about everything, about all of the trouble, about all of it. And how complex and horrific and brilliant and beautiful and awful it all is. And then there's a sense that in the book, or over the period of time it takes to write the book, that you're coming to this understanding that climate change is both too big and too small to hold that. Where do you land with that now? What do you think? You said the book was nearly called "I'm no longer talking to people about climate change," but there is a lot of climate change chat in the book.
There is.
So is there something else we should be talking about? Should we be talking about climate change differently? Should we be posturing ourselves differently?
So what I mean, I suppose, when I say that climate change is at once too big and too small, is even to talk about it in ordinary language is to fall short of acknowledging the scale of what we're talking about. It can, to have climate change as an entry in the Dewey Decimal Index, or as the theme for next month's issue of a magazine, or any of the ways in which it necessarily shows up in the kind of society we have, or even to have a kind of rational debate about it on the Today programme, is kind of a category error, like treating a continent as if it's something you could lift up and look underneath. I find myself remembering at a point near the end of the book a story that Ivan Illich tells of being involved in the peace movement in the early 80s in West Germany, and of these activists who basically decided that the only appropriate response to nuclear weapons was silence, public and demonstrative silence. Standing a bit like the Red Rebels, actually, in a silent vigil on the streets of the small towns in Germany where the American missiles were being brought in to go to the bases. He said, because to enter into a reasoned debate or discussion, or to talk rationally about an abomination is to participate in something abominable. And so I have my moments of going, it would be better to retreat into silence than to pretend that we can talk about this in reasonable, rational terms. But it's also, so if it's too big, it's also too small, because when we talk about climate change, so easily, because of the scale of it and the urgency of it, everything else gets folded in behind it. It becomes the sort of, we end up talking as if it's all staked on whether we, how we respond to climate change. And if we get that right, then everything's going to be back on a sort of Hans Rosling trajectory. And if we get it wrong, then everything's lost. And that's not true either. And there can be a violence that arises from that, especially as we move into this kind of management and control phase of responses to climate change. I had a conversation with Vandana Shiva, the Indian activist in Stockholm last month, which I think it's being released sometime this week on the internet. But she said to me very clearly that she, and she has 50 years behind her of non-violent struggle against, the theft of land, theft of livelihoods, theft of life itself by the patenting of seeds. And she sees these initiatives being funded by billionaires who made their money in the same processes that were behind all of the stuff she has spent her life fighting against. And she says, she's had this conversation with the architects of net zero, where they're kind of basically going, right, we've got the infrastructure and the pipelines now in place. So now what we need is the land. And she's like, no, you people, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you were coming to our countries, taking our land. You're not coming back and doing it again in the name of saving the planet. She said, we are not your carbon sinks. Our fields are not your carbon sinks. And this is going to break wide open now in the next few years. I'm going down to Dartington to do a talk at the Great Hall with Satish Kumar on Friday night. And I'm going to talk about this kind of fork in the road, the extent to which people who have we felt ourselves to be allies are finding ourselves on opposite sides of this fundamental fault line that is now going to emerge in the politics of how we respond to the unfolding of climate change. So I got a bit of a rant there, didn't I, Lydia?
You did, but clearly you needed to. That's all right.
Yeah, I feel very passionate about
better?
that. Oh.
I'm keen to open up the floor to questions if there are some, and forgive us for repeating the question when you shout it out, just so that everyone online and can hear what you're saying. But are there questions in the room? Andy, I can see you posturing yourself. Are you about to shout at me? Did I get there a bit soon? I've seen that face before, that's all. Don't let me rush you.
Stand up when you ask a question.
Form an audience. Mm-hmm. So thinking about the language and form of interconnected and super complex ideas, and how that would then be shared with an audience who may or may not be new to these ideas. Sorry if I put you on the spot there, Andy, but nicely done.
Yeah, thank you.
Styled it out.
Nice question. I sort of say right at the beginning of the book, before chapter 1, there's a thing it's not really an introduction, I don't know what it is, and it's just called First There Must Be an End. And somewhere in that, Yeah, I say, I don't write to announce the end of the world or to change the minds of those who are convinced that the world as we have known it can be saved or made sustainable. I write for anyone who has found themselves, as I have, needing to make sense of what is ending, how we can talk about it, and what tasks are worth taking on in whatever time it turns out that we have. And so that, I mean, I think maybe part of why I had to wait till I was in my mid-40s to actually write a book was because it's taken me this long to stop trying to be clever. Because it's risky, especially if you've had the kind of education that I had. You know, it's so easy to hide behind footnotes and references and big words. And I'm not saying there are no footnotes or references or big words in here, but nonetheless, I hope that the whole thing has the quality of a conversation between friends. I mean, one part of the book, which we haven't spoken about so much tonight, is called Asking Too Much of Science. And it's based on, you know, all of the encounters and in some cases friendships that I've developed over the years with climate scientists. And right at the end of that, I'm talking about the kind of difficulty of the way in which, well, modern society kind of pretends that science is the one kind of knowledge that it takes seriously. And actually, climate change is the place where that the kind of naked truth of that, the sort of emperor's lack of clothes, gets shown up. And that's been really painful for some of the climate scientists who I've known who've been in the process a long time and who have really been on a journey from kind of trusting that the promise of the IPCC, which was that really for the first time in history, you were creating an institutional structure that would directly connect the outputs of scientific research to intergovernmental policy making. And people entered into that in good faith, and then gradually it dawned on them that it wasn't working. So and at the same time, you know, I say, like, what's needed is not actually to simply double down on the rhetoric we have of how important science is. In a weird way, what's called for is for science to take a humbler place in relationship with other skills and practices in order to show up with what it has without letting people pretend that it can do all the work of knowing a thing like climate change or telling us what we need to do. And the image that I have is, I say, you know, this is not knocking science. This is being a friend to science. Because if your friend is on the roof of a building tripping on acid and is convinced that they can fly, to be a friend to them is not to go, yeah, man, go for it. To be a friend is to put your arm around the shoulder and say, why don't we sit over here and have a little chat? And you know, most of the scientists I know have a fairly kind of grounded understanding of the limits of their flying ability, and most of the people who make the brashest claims on behalf of science have never actually seen the inside of a lab. But nonetheless, institutionally and structurally, there is a kind of implicit role that science has been cast in. And I was talking to one of Vanessa's colleagues at the University of British Columbia, who's been doing a project around de-arrogantizing STEM. Science, what is it? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, de-arrogantizing it, like actually creating workshops, working with people in the STEM disciplines to help them bring the parts of themselves that are not welcome to the kind of way you're trained to show up if you work in those disciplines, with the aim of making it possible for them to enter into different kinds of relationships and dialogues with practitioners and scholars in other fields. And so I hope that the whole book has a bit of a quality of the conversation you might have with a friend when something has come to a crisis for you, and maybe that it's helpful to people in those kind of moments.
Having read the book, I can say it does do that. And also, just what you were saying about it's sometimes really difficult, isn't it, to access scientific information about these things because it uses a language that lots of us don't use. And one of the things that I find really valuable in this book is that you put scientific knowledge and conversation alongside Indigenous story, alongside an interaction at a conference, alongside a conversation in the street, and that they're all given equal value, and that part of that message is your story is as valuable. So that's the bit that for me extends into that new audience, a person coming to this for the first time. They have as much knowledge about climate crisis and the trouble we're in general as anybody else. That's what I took from it. Got a couple of hands up. Luke, you want to go? how do you sum that one up for the people online? A question around our neurology and our tendency towards empathy and violence, and the roles that that might play in the approach to this work, and whether Dougald comes across that in his book and his thinking in general.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously one of the people who has been writing about that in great depth is Ian McGilchrist, who wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, which is kind of, you know, a majestic work. By majestic, I mean long. But no, and massively, unbelievably erudite work on, you know, the left brain and the right brain and the different worlds that they bring into being, and a kind of analysis of modernity, actually, in relation to the dominance of the ways of seeing the world that belong to the left hemisphere. I hadn't read that book when I wrote At Work in the Ruins. I read it in the autumn, and I was really struck by the number of places in which there were specific correspondences between lines of thought that I'd arrived at from very other directions in experience and dialogue, and McGilchrist's work on this. And actually, a mutual friend took me up to the Isle of Skye last week to meet him, and we filmed some conversation together, which will get edited and released fairly soon. But I certainly think that some of what is going on in this fork in the road that I'm describing between these very different ways of addressing climate change does seem to map on to what the neuroscience is telling us about the left hemisphere approach to reality. You know, the kind of seeing the world as built up, as kind of almost seeing the world as a machine. I have this image that came to me from my friend and brother, Paul Kingsnorth, where he writes in one of his essays about his son's fish tank and the amount that they've learned as a family from keeping freshwater fish. He says, because, you know, you have to kind of measure the temperature of the tank, and it mustn't get too warm, it mustn't get too cold. You have like 6 different chemicals that you add to control the water according to different tests that you do, and so on. And he says, and all of this work, all of this is what any river or stream or lake does easily and for free. And where I go with that is to go, you know, there are ways of seeing the world, and now, having read McGilchrist's work, I'm putting this together with his interpretation of the neuroscience. There are ways of seeing the world which belong to the left hemisphere, which cannot see the difference between a fish tank and a living river or lake. And the danger is that they then seek to manage the world as if it is a fish tank, as if it is a system in need of human monitoring, management, and control, and or attempt to turn it into one in the interests of sustainability. And I think that, you know, I'm fascinated by the convergence from radically different, you know, fields of practice and scholarship that is going on right now around a reassertion of what goes missing from that lens and that way of seeing the world. And I also think, frankly, that, I mean, I have a podcast called The Great Humbling, and we just did the last episode of the 4th series a few weeks ago, and we called it We Need to Talk About George, because I think that George Monbiot's regenesis and the position that he has arrived at is, frankly, something that comes from that, you know, what the neuroscientists would say is the left hemisphere approach to reality. And it wasn't easy for me to say that, because although we've had disagreements over the years, the role that George has played within British environmentalism has been enormous and vital, and I wouldn't have wanted to play the role that he's been playing. In some ways, he's the only person who could have done it. So it doesn't come to me easily to try and open up that conversation. And what we did in the podcast was to try and do it in a nuanced way rather than a combative way, although that's a bit hard when the other person involved defaults to a very combative approach to reality, let's say. But I'm very struck by, I mean, if we've said that Vanessa's Hospicing Modernity is one of the books without which I couldn't have written this book, the other one that stands equally close to it is Chris Smage's book, A Small Farm Future. And I got to meet Chris for the first time last week, which was lovely. And part of what I really, really get out of Chris's work is, you know, here's someone who had a career as a quantitative social scientist before he left academia and became a farmer in his 30s. He's gone on doing research, and he really knows statistics. He really knows both how you do it well and the limits of doing it. And the contrast between the way in which he uses what the quantitative representations of the world are able to give us and how we make judgments based on them, and the approach which George is taking, which it seems to me repeats a pattern that I describe in one of the historical sections of the book, which is again and again in the history of modernity, there have been these attempts, which McGilchrist would see as the left brain taking control. There have been these attempts to get rid of the fragile, fallible exercise of human judgment and replace it with the fruits of measurement and calculation. And again, these attempts have failed. And we're living through another failure of them in the way that we've approached climate change. But I find it really heartening that somebody who really has the skills that I don't have of working with the data that Chris has is engaging in this more nuanced way that's not simplifying it to, it's not simplifying it perhaps as much as I accidentally do at times in my writing. But I think these are conversations we need to have, and I think that the kind of work that you're talking about there brings something really helpful to making sense of what might be going on.
And I think you'd like Chris Major's book, knowing a little bit about the work that you do. I think it's your bag.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Did I see a hand over here earlier? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thoughts on patriarchy, the unnamed thread in the room.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you for naming it and bringing it into the middle of the conversation. Yeah, there's this knot of things that we need to hospice, which is, patriarchy is at the center of it, and colonialism is at the center of it, and we have to bring the damage into view. We have to bring the unstated privileges that are operating in the spaces we're in into view. We have to find ways of setting each other free without that being done in a way that just sort of, it's funny, it's a weird connection, but what's coming to mind is the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was part of the resistance to the Nazis within the German church when the Nazis and the mainstream of the church was basically kind of going hand in glove in the 30s, and he was killed by the Nazis in the 40s. But he had this thing where he talked about cheap grace, and he said the German church is offering people cheap grace. And he was talking about the costly grace, that's what's needed. And I think that thing of the cheap versus the costly comes to me in when we do start to get into conversations where we bring these things into view, is we have to find ways of, freeing each other and, getting everybody free of the prisons that we have built, that are prisons that have benefited some people more than others, but have actually damaged everybody, even the ones who've benefited from it. But it can't be done the cheap way. It has to be done the costly way, which is hard work, which means going at the speed of trust, working through relationship, and recognizing the ways in which the damage or the unexamined privilege that we're carrying is going to show up, going to repeat itself as a pattern, however much work we've done. So, yeah.
If it's not too self-indulgent, I would add that when I was asked to do this, I originally said no, and then he asked again, and I said, oh, all right then. But part of that is that we're so saturated with white male voices of a particular age group commenting on things as they are and giving us facts about what we should potentially do next. And there's a very, very, very small number of white men, straight, in their 40s that I would make space for or make extra time for on my bookshelf, and this man is one of them. And part of the reason for that is that his texts and his work in general and the way he speaks becomes a platform for every voice that is marginalized for another reason. So I've learned more about Indigenous voices via Dougald than any other writer directly. I've found my way down the small path to other small mycelial paths that lead off in other places where I can go and inhabit for a while and not look back and find Dougald again if I don't want to. But you find those places through this text. So I, whilst the word patriarchy isn't used in the book at all, I find it a deeply resistant to patriarchal text. But that helps.
Bless you, Lydia. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hear me. Hiya. Yeah. So if the world has ended already, then does that let us off the hook doing anything about it? Both the small us and the big us.
Thank you. Thanks for pinning me down on that one, because it needs to.
Naomi's good at pinning people down to the
Thanks,
big questions.
So I start the book very early on by quoting the lines that were most important to me over the years from what Paul and I wrote in the Dark Mountain Manifesto, which are the very final lines where we say, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop. So a world is coming to an end. The world of the patriarchy, the world of the powerful. And, I can't sit here and pretend that I have not been among the people who have been the winners of that world. But if we do not make the distinction between the world as we know it and the world full stop, we will end up defending the world as we know it as if we're defending the world full stop. And that, I say, is, we see that already, whether it is the way in which refugees who are being displaced by changing patterns of heat and rain are being kept out of Europe, or whether it's the schemes that the billionaires are funding for geoengineering so that we can somehow go on the trajectories that they can't imagine living without and solve the climate crisis. And so, I really want to stand for both sides of that distinction, that we mustn't let people use the end of the world as we know it as an excuse to pretend, oh, it's all ending. It isn't. There's work to be done. That's why the book's called At Work in the Ruins. There are tasks that are called for. And, plenty of people are living among the ruins already. I tell this story of going out to Mexico to meet Gustavo Esteva a long time ago and listening to his stories. And, he had this whole story that I tell of the 3 turnings in his life where he turned away from what looked like a sensible path. And this spoke to me because it reminded me of being 25 and leaving the BBC. And the last of the turnings, when he was about the age I am now, was that he turned down a cabinet position in the Mexican government in 1976. And he said, I couldn't explain to anyone why I was walking away, because this government was being formed by my friends and comrades, people who I had worked with for years, and I'd been a senior civil servant who'd been doing what I thought was good work, but I just knew in my heart of hearts that there was a gap, that we couldn't bridge between how the world looked from that office and how it was for people on the ground. And so he went and worked with these grassroots movements in the barrios in Mexico City over the next years. And in 1985, when the earthquake came, that devastated Mexico City, the movements he was part of had been, one of the things that they were doing was composting toilets. And national and local government had been absolutely trying to eliminate this because this wasn't developed. This was like third world, and Mexico was, it was going to develop, it was going to become modern, and there was no place for having, dealing with your own shit. It should be being flushed away by water down a pipe to somewhere else, as if there is such a place as away. And then when the earthquake came, the only people who had an answer, and Rebecca Solnit writes about this in one of her books, she tells the story brilliantly of the movements that Gustavo was part of. They were the only people with an answer when half of a city of 20 million people had all of its sewage pipes fractured. And so suddenly the people who'd just been this pain in the ass that the government was trying to legislate against became the people with the answer. And I think that might be a source of hope for us in the things that we're involved in. I actually find myself quoting Milton Friedman at one point in the book, because there's a great line from the memoir that he and his wife Rose wrote together, where they say, we don't make radical arguments in order to try and persuade people that we are right, but in order to keep options available for the moment of crisis. Some of us are going to be doing work which has that quality, that is keeping options available, because there's not going to be a day that is the end of the world as we know it. The end of the world as we know it ends slowly. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, as the sci-fi writers say. And therefore, in pockets, we can be practicing and building up skills and capacities that will still work in times when systems that we wouldn't want to just pull out from under us overnight now, we want to also keep them going as we hospice them, but when they can no longer deliver. So to me, those are some of the spaces into which the work of being with these times might lead us.
Reminds me of my favourite artist is Joanna van Huyswyk. She's a Dutch artist, and she talks about building skills for the not yet, that we don't know what the front line will look like or when it will arrive or whether we've already passed 50 of them, but we're always building skills for the not yet. I think
you introduced me to her and that line years ago, and it's stuck with me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I still love it. Yeah, we'll do these last two if that's okay, because I'm aware of time.
But then we'll be sticking around, so there'll be time to chat and
totally
hang out.
Hot chocolates, warming up, buying books. It's going to be great. You want to go? Yeah. So I don't want to summarize that too bluntly, but it's something about the work of midwifing the new being more attractive than hospicing modernity, because it's ugly and hard and sad and grief-stricken at times, and how can we hold ourselves in that place and potentially do that gently and maybe even joyfully.
Thank you. Yeah, that brought something into clarity for me that I hadn't seen so clearly. Because when Vanessa talks about hospicing modernity, she also talks about, she doesn't say midwifing, she looks for a slightly humbler role, assisting with the birth of something new as yet unknown, possibly, but not necessarily wiser, and not smothering that new thing with our projections. But the bit that I see more clearly hearing you speak about it is, you know, the hospicing work is sad and involves dealing with shit. And yeah, there can be an attraction towards the assisting with the birth of the new. And I'm thinking about some of the things that I've heard from Vanessa from the different Indigenous communities that her collective is working with. One thing they talk about is passing trauma upwards. So within the kind of, you know, finding relationships where you have those who, you know, who are in some way elders to you, and that you pass your trauma up that chain, not down the chain to the people younger and newer in whatever you're doing. But you do need people who you can talk about the shit with. And then they also, she tells this very powerful story about working with a teenage girl who was suicidal, and who the counselling that she was getting in school was basically saying, you know, basically, she said, the counselling that they are giving me in school is telling me not to feel the pain of the world so that I can get better. I can't, like, that's not right, is it? And they took this question together to one of the Indigenous communities, and this is in Canada where Vanessa lives. And the elders sat with it for a few weeks, and then the answer that they came with was, we think that you guys need to practice enlarging your hearts. And what they meant by that was, they said, it feels like you feel that the only scale at which the heart exists is an individual on their own. But that's only one of the scales at which the heart exists. There's also the heart of you and me. There's the heart of you in me. There's the heart of beyond you and me. And there are ways of actually practicing and learning to experience that together. And I think in a strange way that starts to happen in the kinds of spaces that these conversations can open up on evenings like tonight. It's not some kind of, we have to be careful about not exoticizing these things when we're learning in dialogue with people who are coming from cultures that have been both oppressed and exoticized by people who look like us for a long time. But there's a lot of kind of, we're having to start from a position of being not very skillful at it, you know, because we don't have storytellers who were trained from the age of 8 and not allowed out in front of an audience till they were 40. But then the other bit, there was another bit that comes from that as well. Oh, that was it. One of the most recent conversations I had with Vanessa, she said, yeah, one of the groups said to us, we've noticed that you white folks, you seem to need everyone to get to tell their personal story and have it heard by everyone in order to process the shit. And we were a bit worried that there might not be time. And they said, and we think that you need to remember that this is what ritual does, that ritual, which you have within your culture, you've just forgotten what it's for, that ritual creates a space in which we're able to do that thing and let it happen in a way that doesn't require this centering of self-narration that tends to be the way that most of us like default to if we're coming out of modernity, in order to do the work of processing our trauma and our shit. And that, so those are some of the kind of the pieces that I think you're right. You know, if we are doing the hospicing work rather than the midwifing work, I think we might be particularly in need of listening to and learning from practices that give us a chance or direct us to what's already there within our cultures that might help us to, you know, to not hide the trauma and not turn the trauma into a costume either. Yeah.
One of the ideas from the book that helped me with the bridge that you're describing, I can't remember if they're your words or if you're quoting someone else, but you talk about the idea of giving up and how useful it is to give up. And that at the time of giving up, it feels like you're giving up on everything, only later on for it to become more clear that actually it's always just giving up on something, not everything. So there's something about letting yourself go and believe that you're giving up on everything in order to see the perspective in hindsight that it was something and not all of it, that actually I find quite hopeful, that, you know, the kind of, yeah, it's all gone, but actually that's when then the shoots and the roots come through in death, I think. There was one more hand. Yeah, go for it. Do religion and spirituality have roles to play in reevaluating some of these aims and goals?
I found myself speaking about this unexpectedly on Saturday in Glasgow, and you've asked the question, so I'm going to need to speak about it again. I heard a talk a couple of weeks ago, and I must learn the name of the man who gave the talk, but it's in the Substack post that I put up earlier today. He's an Islamic philosopher, and he talks about this thing he calls the Secularocene instead of the Anthropocene. And it's only about 12 minutes long, this talk that he gave at the Black Elephant Lectures in Paris. And he says, you know, on this journey into modernity, heaven didn't go away, heaven was relocated. Modernity was this project of attempting to build heaven on earth. And no one asked the earth. The earth didn't ask to bear the weight of us trying to make it heaven. And that somewhere deep down in the roots of this, now the language of heaven might not be everybody's cup of tea. And I think that when we venture into the realm of the sacred, into the things that religions and spiritual traditions talk about, what I notice as someone who works with words is that we get into a territory where language is being used in ways that deliberately stop making sense. It's a pattern you see in all traditions. The unspeakable name of God in the Hebrew Bible, the first line of the Tao Te Ching being the Tao, that the way that can be spoken is not the true way. It's like the finger pointing at the moon, and the words can only ever be the finger. So don't get stuck on the language of heaven if that's an obstacle. But what came to me in Glasgow talking about this on Saturday night was, if it is the case that at some deep level there is truth in this suggestion that how we got into this mess was not just a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry, but the result of an approach to the world, a way of treating everyone and everything. And if, as this guy is suggesting, it might be helpful to describe that in terms of we took the stories of heaven and tried to make that a practical, reality with tools and plans and schemes on earth, and the earth didn't ask to bear the weight of our attempt to make the earth be heaven, then somehow, one of the tasks that may be called for, which some of us may be called towards, is working out a different relationship between whatever it is we're talking about when we talk about heaven and earth. And I do see, many of my friends in different traditions, and sometimes, really solidly saying, really solidly disagreeing with each other, but nonetheless being in interesting mutual dialogue, feeling a call that they might not have expected 5 or 10 years ago towards deepening into standing in and working with and staying with the trouble of different religious and spiritual traditions. So it does seem to me that that's among the things that's being called for. Yes.
We're going to stick around, so please feel free to talk to us. But thank you for asking me to have this conversation with you. I'm glad I said yes eventually.
I'm glad you let me persuade you. I've been so happy to be sat here with you, Lydia. It's been a real pleasure. It's been like taking a friendship that's been I think important to both of us, and inviting the rest of you in to join us in that.
And I hope that's not been really boring to watch. I hope that's been a really, because that could be quite self-indulgent. No, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you everyone watching online. I know someone who messaged me earlier saying that they were going to watch this on the coach on the way home from something. So wherever you are in the world, I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you for this. And thank you all for coming. It's good, wasn't it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Should we warm up?
We should. Let's
I'll put you. There you go. Oh man, is that what we've looked like all the way through?
Maybe it is. In stream, I think that's the button we need to click.
Lights and current. Oh wow, we've talked for ages.